Hello and welcome to the Gnostic Warrior podcast, broadcasting from GnosticWarrior.com in San Diego, California, to around the world. I'm your host, Mo, and in this episode, I have the pleasure of interviewing a true master researcher, symbologist, and author, Cort Lindhal. Cort is the author of several books and has spent the last decade of his life examining the global cultural affections which have been mostly neglected by modern archaeologists and anthropologists. Cort tells us about people such as Harvey Spencer Lewis, the founder of the American Order of the Rosicrucians, Russian occultists, Madame Helena Blavatsky, and Sir Francis Bacon were some of the many conspirators with international royal affiliations who had taken part in this once hidden plot to create the United States of America. His great work aligns exactly with the Masonic philosopher and 33rd Degree Freemason Manly P. Hall's secret destiny of America, a secret that Hall says was for the setting up the machinery for a universal brotherhood of nations and races. The mechanism for the accomplishment for this ideal was set in motion in the ancient temples of Greece, Egypt, and India. So brilliant was the plan, and so well was it administered, that it has survived to our time, and it will continue to function until the great work is accomplished. Before we get into the Gnostic Warrior podcast, here's a word from our sponsors. This podcast is brought to you by Pure Hydrogen Peroxide. When you need a powerful disinfectant to kill mold, bacteria, and viruses like the coronavirus, you're going to need something like high-grade hydrogen peroxide, and that's exactly what I have for you. Go to purehydrogenperoxide.com and get a powerful disinfectant for your home, or if you're a healthcare provider or you work in the medical industry, make sure that your hospital or your healthcare facility has pure hydrogen peroxide, and it kills 99.9% of the germs, viruses, and bacteria out there. You don't want to be caught without it. This podcast is also brought to you by Mold Safe Solutions. When you're looking for something powerful to kill that demonic fungi lurking within your walls, you're going to want to use Mold Safe Solutions. Formulated by Mo, the Mold Man, you know where to go to get the best stuff to kill that mold in your house. Go to moldsafesolutions.com for more information or to get your cleaner today. Or you can go to our forum at moldsafesolutions/forum, where we'll answer your questions to your toxic mold problems and hopefully guide you in the right direction and give you the solutions you need. Welcome to the Gnostic Warrior, Cort. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, Mo. Thanks for having me on. I'm eager to chat with you and fill you in on what I've been finding.
You're welcome, and it's a pleasure to have you on. And I've been, fascinated by the work that you have been doing. And, before we get into that great work, can you please tell us a little bit about who you are and your background for those people that don't know you?
Sure. Well, I've been studying all of this now for about 8 years, or a little longer, because I've always been a rabid history fan. And I studied a lot of history and anthropology in school that's served me well in my studies now, including a lot of geography classes where I learned how to draw maps and interpret maps and investigate historical maps. So that interest brought me to looking at people like Thomas Jefferson and others who may have kind of involved themselves in what may be termed personal meridians, or the establishment of a kind of personal prime meridian for practical reasons. That tradition's based on the legal definition of property, but some of what was valued in this kind of value we see like in the streets of Washington, D.C., where there are several established meridians. And I began to look at these things and found a tradition that kind of went back into antiquity. Along the way exposed a lot of interesting truths, if you really dig in.
And these truths aren't something that you'll find or be taught in a history class.
No, and it's all a lot interpretive, but there's a lot of facts too that if you just look at are kind of undeniable as well. But really, along the way, you kind of have to become adept at interpreting mythology and folklore to kind of delve into the real meanings of things. And there's kind of people later during the 18th and 19th century, like Emanuel Swedenborg, for instance, that just tells you outright that the metaphors in Greek mythology, for instance, are valued in a real way for a real reason. And after a while, these kind of things became somewhat of a mystery school way to communicate for political reasons. And there's a long history of that kind of leading up to the way it was applied in the United States in the early republic and everything. And a lot of people like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and others all kind of displayed tenets of this in their own architecture that they built. So that's very interesting too. And what I found was a kind of stream of information that led to Williamsburg and Jamestown, where kind of the first linear array of architecture of this type was made in the colonies. You see, they've kind of reproduced it at colonial Williamsburg today, but among the features there of the governor's mansion, the colonial capitol or House of Burgesses, and the College of William and Mary is the octagonal powder magazine. And that is one of the first kind of things that I started to look at that I realized was a prime meridian or a datum or a place from which to measure. That as I kept searching along, I found that it was possible that the octagonal form of this building was even used as a directional device in intentionally contrived mysteries that in which you were meant to learn these historical truths, or it was meant to prompt you in that direction, was likely one of the reasons these things were even arranged. So it's kind of like some of the concepts involved in the medieval cathedrals, that if you're going to take all the effort to build something like that, that you will put a lot of symbolism and information in there as well, if you're going to go to those kind of efforts.
Sure. And it's interesting, you talk about how these myths and these mysteries all tie into true reality. And I don't think a lot of people out there get that. And you had mentioned the Greek mysteries. And so, Cort, I have extensive study in that area. My ancestry genealogy goes back to the Greek Hellenes, the Phoenicians, and so forth. So I've been naturally kind of drawn to that history and decoding it. And I'm going on about 8 years myself. So we're about, the same amount of time as far as research into the mysteries, and then, just different kind of niches of what we do. So it's, it's interesting you say that. And I think it's important that the audience understands out there that these myths were not written for no reason. And there was usually mystery schools tied to these historians and these people that were often connected to the state, whether that be the Greek government or whoever it might be, the courts of Egypt, in Rome, etc. And they've encoded not only all these mysteries in writing, but also in stone. So it's awesome you say that. And all this history is meant to last forever.
Right.
And I'm going to be honest with you, Cort, I'm blown away by your work, the great work you've been doing now on the true history of the United States. I would say, personally, and I've been researching this for a while, and I've talked to a lot of people, you have to be in the top three. And it's not just the research material that you're putting out there, it's the way that you're doing it so simply. And that's what I love about it. It's just really great. And I think it's fascinating. I wish more people, knew about this, in our country and so forth. So let's get into the work a little bit. I know the axis mundi plays a large part in this. Can you explain to the audience what an axis mundi is?
Sure. It's kind of analogous to the axial center of the world, or literally the point on which the world turns. And this is interesting, too, because it kind of relates to this, the polar projection maps that a lot of believers in the flat Earth point to as representing the Earth being flat. And I applaud those people for questioning and searching and everything. But in my experience, everything I've found, the world is a sphere. And really there's intricate parts of history in which this just can't be denied or faked or anything like that. So, but that's a whole nother show.
Sure.
But really what the ancients would do is create a map. Let's take Jerusalem, for example, where that would be the axial center of the map. So all the measurements of like all of the resources of the kingdom or the people that controlled that center point or capital would be measured with regard to that point on the earth. And this is also analogous to a prime meridian being established, such as we see at Greenwich, England, the famous Paris meridian, and even the meridian at the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., which all of our ships at sea refer to for their time coordinates. So this is a tradition that goes way back into antiquity. We see places like the Great Pyramid of Giza, I believe, was established as this, along with Heliopolis in Egypt, from where an octagonal scheme was the basic form that seems to have been valued, and maybe earlier in antiquity, the hexagonal form would be valued. So what I'm talking about is if somebody places a stop sign on the ground, which is an octagon, and each way each facet points, and the in-between points, so every 22.5 degrees could be a direction that would be valued in a talismanic manner. And we even see tenets of this in the Muslim faith, in the way how Muslims pray towards Mecca, and the mihrab in each mosque is actually oriented to point to Mecca, regardless of the orientation of the building it's placed within. So they do actually value the real direction on the globe that would point to Mecca, and just not praying to the east, for example, if you're in the United States. And that's also interesting because in pagan times or pre-Muslim times, Mecca was even a center of a goddess worship in which 360 idols were placed within the Kaaba, or the black cube at the center of what's the Grand Mosque today. And we see coincidentally that equals the number of degrees in a circle. So that, coupled with their value of praying towards Mecca, kind of displays in a way the religious and philosophical overtones of places like Baalbek. Even the Dome of the Rock at first was valued in this manner by Muslims. But what was interesting when I first started to look in, I found that seemingly the archetype of the more modern form of this beyond the Egyptian culture was the Tower of the Winds in Athens, Greece, which is a small, kind of demure octagonal tower there just north of the Acropolis that was, many people speculate, was used as a timekeeping device. The exterior does have sundials, and they even suspect there was a water clock, a pressurized water clock within the Tower of the Winds that could have allowed the Greeks to fix longitude at that time, which is analogous to the spinning of the earth and the way we measure time as well. So each side of the octagon and even the corners all had a specific deity or god assigned to them. That's all part of the mythology of the winds. And we see especially later Constantine seemingly valuing this form and creating his Daphne Palace in Constantinople, or modern Istanbul, in which the central room of his quarters was an octagon that had deities on each facet as well. And we know with his Greek heritage and the Byzantine culture being more Eastern oriented that he valued this and repeated it. He built another octagon in Antioch. A lot of sources say that Constantine even built an octagon on the Temple Mount prior to the Dome of the Rock being built. And there's a lot of interesting, progression of architectural history on the Temple Mount that suggests this could be true. So that's very interesting, kind of thing that it is at least suggested that's outside the bounds of what most people would believe, because even the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which most people would regard as a Muslim structure, other sources say was originally built by Justinian I as the Church of St. Mary Justinian. So it's interesting, we see this there in Jerusalem kind of obviously being the archetype of a church that would align with a geometric structure like the Dome of the Rock. If you look into the history of this form, it developed in Ravenna, Italy, and through the auspices of Constantine long before the Muslims would ever build a form like this. And indeed, the octagonal form, too, came to be regarded as a baptistry in association with many churches in early Christianity and Eastern Christianity. So a lot of the breakdown of that does indicate that there could be something at play on the Temple Mount that hasn't been told or somehow obscured by history. And from realizing this, I was even kind of compelled to look at the myth of the Knights Templar who lived in the Al-Aqsa Mosque or in that area of the Temple Mount during their time there, according to a lot of sources, and supposedly found hidden information that empowered them somehow until their demise there in the 14th century. But I think really one of the possibilities that is suggested by the mythology of Charlemagne later and subsequent Frankish and German rulers, that Constantine may have even been interred in the Temple Mount below the octagon that he had originally built. And later there's indications from Justinian II that he influenced the building of the Dome of the Rock even at the date in the 7th century when it was supposed to have been built. So there's a lot of backstory there, and it's hard to explain in a short period of time, but there's a lot of intrigue going on there that in turn will lead us to Ravenna in the post-Constantine era and the way Byzantine rulers valued that at a time prior to when the Dome of the Rock was built.
Your hypothesis, I feel is right on, because if you look at the history of religions and the different empires and so forth, and we could see, this especially in the Catholic Church, they were known to build their churches on old pagan holy spots. So if we look at the Islamic religion, the Muslims and so forth, their religion came about in what is the 6th century AD or?
Yes.
Okay. So it would only be natural if these holy places were there and the Muslims had conquered these Christian areas or these other empires, whether it be, a Roman stronghold or whatever it was at that time, that they would in turn incorporate a lot of these buildings into their own buildings or build right on top of them. And then, of course, a lot of the people they would conquer might have some of these secrets, where, the philosophers, the builders and so forth. And it's either, be killed or, work for your new king that just conquered your kingdom. So possibly, that may tie into it as well. And
that's interesting, because even I think if you look at the history, it may even be that Muhammad realized what was really going on there.
Sure.
Because at first that was the center of the Muslim faith. And then it was moved to Mecca. And this was after, of course, he had his famous night journey where he flew into the sky on his winged horse, Barak, or lightning,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting too. But I think he just realized how controversial the Temple Mount was to Christians and Jews, and maybe decided to make his center of faith at another place because of this.
Makes sense.
He was a wise man. And by the way, I just want to say none of this is meant as an affront to any Muslims or anything. It's just things that you see as you really look into these kind of things.
Sure. That's what you have to do when you study history, mythology, and so forth. And, a lot of this history crosses over, into different religions and so forth. And, you try to honor, of course, their traditions and their faiths. And, you're just trying to get to the true history behind all that stuff, and I agree with you, Cort. It's not to offend anybody there of their religious beliefs and so forth. It's just, I think, great work. And, maybe if more people of that faith or whatever faith they are, they understood some of these truths, they might be even more interested in their religions and the history of it, as opposed to just, maybe like Catholics and Christians going to church on Sunday and, that's all they do. I feel it's much more than that. And it's a fascinating history. And I know there are connections
with the goddess and with the Islamic religion and so forth. And Manly P. Hall had associated the planet Venus and Friday with the Islamic religion. And I know that the green and that crescent has something to do with that. But again, that's another podcast in itself. And, this meridian that you're talking about, the axis mundi and so forth, what do you feel is the main purpose? Was it they were honoring, at this time, of course, they didn't have computers and GPS. This was the way they navigated the world, and this was really important to them, so they honored it through these various traditions and these mysteries? Or is there any type of secret energies that comes out of this axis mundi?
Right. That's kind of a chicken before the egg kind of question. It's hard to discern, but really what we do see in antiquity and as time progressed, that the sciences were wrapped up in spirituality and explained that way, even through a lot of metaphor and the myths and legends that we're talking about. Some of them infer these kind of things. Over time, I think the priesthood were the people who first figured out all of what we would consider to be math and science later. And a lot of these priesthoods are augurs, as they were known in Greek culture and Roman culture, were kind of filled the niche that monks would later fill in the Christian religion. So they were privy and also would recruit brilliant people if they recognized somebody that was very apt or was displayed a propensity for these kind of things. They would recruit them and make them part of their priesthood as well. So we see early forms of colleges or schools kind of evolving in a spiritual vein that supported the notion of the gods or a specific deity that also became associated in turn with the ruler, who often was identified as being divinely connected to the gods. So these people, the practical uses of the axis or the prime meridian would be to physically define your domain. But also, I believe they would establish temples or events that were in conjunction with this octagonal scheme suggested by the Tower of the Winds. For instance, we see things like the Battle of Troy and Marathon, and a lot of the more significant sites like Achaia, Olympia, being aligned with the octagonal scheme of the Tower of the Winds. So that's interesting too. And if I knew more about Greek culture than I do, or could visit Greece, I'm sure I would find other things associated as well. I mean, there's even later parts of the Roman agora in Athens that they seem to have oriented to point to the Tower of the Winds along one of these octagonal lines. So the Greeks were also, Romans were also aware of this concept through their appreciation of the Greek culture, and also the Etruscans earlier in what would become Italy seemed to be aware. They had a 16-point system that with deities assigned to each direction, just like at the Tower of the Winds. So it's hard to say even who developed this kind of more modern, accurate form of doing this. And this is somewhat before modern navigation or the advent of nautical clocks dictate that this was more accurate and more possible later in history. But I believe it was a cloistered thing that was of value to rulers to define their claims or parts of their domain. And this is kind of also a concept you see in the, quote, occult, where certain practitioners of it value certain shapes and everything. The old classic, example of somebody putting a pentagram on the floor and casting spells and things like that kind of harkens back to this concept as well. So it has a lot of practical and spiritual tenets to it that you can apply and learn a lot about history and culture from.
Sure, and that gets into the numerology as well, which plays a part in this. And, my research, and of course I had mentioned my genealogy goes back to the Greek Hellenes, and before them, if we look who had ruled, I'd say the waterways, and we could say, brought their teachings across the world. Again, I'll quote Manly P. Hall, not verbatim, but he had mentioned that the Phoenicians were the ones that brought Masonry to all the corners of the world. The Phoenicians were the race before the Greek kingdom came in. And if you look at where the Phoenician strongholds were, of course, you see the Greek Empire later in those same areas. So I believe that they are one and the same. Because when I look at, just so you know, Cort, when I have my DNA certificate, it says I'm a Phoenician and I'm a Greek Hellene. And then I'm a Celt as well. And all those, what I've researched, they're all the same. And you had mentioned the Etruscans.
The Etruscans?
The Etruscans, yeah.
Kind of the proto-Romans.
Yeah, and my research ties them to the Phoenicians as well. They were just, sitting there at that one time. And, I have this theory that, you have all these Phoenician colonies and these boats circumventing the world. And then you have Greece later, I feel, doing kind of the same thing, is that they lost touch with one another, even though that they had these different, markers and they could read the stars and, navigate the oceans. I feel that, hundreds of years sometimes passed before they met again. And I think some of these things were forgotten, and so you have a new guy coming here on a boat, whether it be the Greeks or the Romans or whoever in the future. And they're like, who are these people? And of course, when you have someone coming onto your land, you immediately want to defend yourself. And I think that just kind of just a cycle of repeating itself, with the Vikings later, the Anglo-Saxons, and then you have the Ottomans and, Genghis Khan and so forth. I just think it's just that cycle that repeats itself and people just make their claims on the same spots. But, it's very interesting that you talk about the priests, because I know, back into Egypt, they were in charge of history and writing this down. And I'm sure that tradition carried on for thousands of years.
Right, and some of the things you read about Egypt as well says that the Needers kind of realigned the agricultural fields after each flood using monuments that they could see. Kind of a baseline to use to even divide property, and that is the logical progression of the whole thing. I mean, even later here in the United States during Jefferson's administration, they developed the township and range system that legally describes property. And that has some interesting parallels to magic squares with the numerology that you were speaking of before, because they're numbered backwards starting in the upper right-hand corner, and the numbers proceed to the bottom to 36, which also ends up in the lower right-hand corner. But if you add those numbers in total, it equals 666. And so, a lot of the functions of magic squares are used to encode things as well. And Benjamin Franklin was famous for using those as well. He was kind of one of the spy masters of early America, or the postmaster, which was analogous to that during that era. So it's interesting that even this legal description of property through time also has the spiritual overtones associated with it, even to the point where we now see, wherever the prime meridian that time is measured from seems to have some values associated with that as well.
And in your opinion, how much of an influence did the Freemasons have in the formation of the colonies and, of course, then the United States?
I think they had a huge influence, and but I would also say that it's overblown a lot in favor of history that presents a more American way later. If I were to be honest, if you really examine the formation of the United States, you'd have to look at the Jacobites of England and Scotland, who were in many ways oriented towards the Catholic Church. And that's really interesting and surprising to a lot of people. But if you look at the history of England and Scotland, starting with, let's say, Mary Queen of Scots, you see a lot of the Stuart kings of Scotland that also ruled England losing their heads, in part because they were Catholic and they were at odds with the Parliament coming and going. That England was going through this struggle, of a form of monarchy coupled with some form of democratic government as well, and it kept going back and forth. So English Catholics were in favor during one ruler, out of favor the next, in favor again, with all along people like Charles I losing their head over it as well. One of his bastard sons was also beheaded in a revolt to try to regain the Scottish crown. And we see, as this progressed to later, the time of James II and Bonnie Prince Charlie, that they actually ejected the original Stuart kings and replaced them with their Hanoverian German cousins, who were just as much of Stuart blood, but had married into the German families. So these exiled kings attempted a couple of major revolts to regain the crown in 1715 and 1745. And each time, a lot of the refugees, which they lost both confrontations, would come to the colonies or to Scandinavia. A lot of them, we even see the Hamilton family being of Swedish nobility, other Scottish names like Brown and Douglas being present in the Scandinavian countries because they would go fight as mercenaries for these other nations and become involved in the development of those countries. And I believe the United States is no different. So even though a lot of these Jacobites weren't Catholic, only about 20% of them were, these people all came from the families that benefited from these Stuarts being kings, as in their business ventures. The whole fabric of society and everything in England revolved around the king, and all of a sudden this was taken away, and all the advantages these people had as well were gone. So a lot of these people came to the colonies and did affect the development of the revolution. I mean, even afterwards, there was an attempt or a movement to make Bonnie Prince Charlie the King of the United States.
Interesting.
So everyone can look that up. That's true. I didn't want to believe it at first. And of course, if you look at where James II and Bonnie Prince Charlie are buried or entombed, you'll have to go to the Vatican to see where they're buried.
I'm here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I've been here about a year, and you go to the History Museum, and at that time, all you see here, of course, are the conquistadors that were hired by the Spanish crown, and then you have the Jesuits as well, setting up all the different missionaries. And when I've studied the history of Freemasonry, what a lot of people don't understand is that the major employers of Freemasons for hundreds and hundreds of years was the Catholic Church. So, if you're going to build all these churches out of stone, you're going to need someone to build them for you. And naturally, you're going to hire stonemasons to do that, the operative masons of that time. And that just continued on until it got to speculative Freemasonry. And these people that you talk about, let's start talking about them and educate the audience. For example, your latest series of work deals with Northern California and what played out there, and specifically surrounding a man named John Bidwell. Please tell us about John Bidwell and how he played a large part in the forming of the state of California, and of course, Chico as well.
Right. Well, John Bidwell was one of the earlier pioneers of California. He came on a wagon train to California in 1841, which was significantly ahead of the gold rush that came later. And when he came here, he worked for John Sutter, who's famous later for owning the land where the gold was first discovered, so they say. I think that part of what we're seeing, too, is an early kind of movement where the United States was kind of sending people that they could trust and know here in case it could become part of the country later. Because we see even when John Bidwell first arrived here, there was a Russian colony in Bodega Bay, where they had actually leased this large chunk of Northern California coastal area from Mexico and had a colony there, I think, for over 50 years. So right at about the time, I think they left in 1846. I'm not 100% positive there, but it was soon after Bidwell came. There were lots of things as I first started to study these kind of architectural clues that are given to you. I was fortunate enough to once have lived in Williamsburg, Virginia, and then I moved here to Chico, and I had always noticed the city plaza and the way some of the town was set up seemed to be what would be considered a New Jerusalem with these arrays of architecture. A lot of these things refer to that or the concept of the New Atlantis of Sir Francis Bacon, who also seemed to surround himself with Jesuit Freemasons, by the way. Since you mentioned that before, I remembered that.
Well, yeah, I believe he went to a Jesuit college as well.
Right.
So it makes sense.
That influence is there, and that's part of what I'm saying about the development of America, because later you just see him being valued so much as inspiring a lot of these New Jerusalems or New Atlantis, or the way all of our state capital arrays are set up and things like that. So, but back to John Bidwell, when I noticed this, it was just interesting, and I started to look at it, and I did notice architecture around Chico, such as the old Bank of America building, having an array of gods and goddesses associated with the artwork on it, and how John Bidwell's home aligned with the Chico City Plaza and things like that. So as I delved into his background, I found a biography of his cousin, Benson Bidwell, who invented a motor for electric trolley cars. So he was a well-known man, and even in his biography, it mentions that he's cousins with General John Bidwell of Chico and everything. And in this book, it's amazing because it says the Bidwell name originally in England was Biddulph, of which there's a town in England named Biddulph even today. But the seed of the Biddulph family was a man named Ormus Legadon. And Legadon means the standard bearer. And this man was actually said to have been a Knights Templar standard bearer. So he even had collateral relations through his family to Charlemagne and many of the Latin kingdoms of Jerusalem, of the people who ruled the Levant or Holy Land during the Latin kingdom when the Crusades took place. So here's a man that's intimately, associated with a bloodline of great rulers and all of the kind of mythology and lore we see that sprung up around the Knights Templar, and even later royal orders like the Order of the Garter in the Bath or the Order of the Crescent in Europe and other things like this. It's one thing I might note, that a lot of things that people attribute to Knights Templar may indeed be due to these royal orders and their influence on gentry families in the United States who they were related to and had business dealings with as well. So as time went on, the Bidwell family became part of the founders of Hartford, Connecticut. And as I looked at the founder's statue of Hartford, Connecticut, I saw a lot of names associated with California and indeed Chico history, including Bidwell, Bacon, Lewis, many others, all, the Marsh family, that all had a great impact on the development of Chico and Butte County, where I live, that all settled families here. I even found a member of the Bruce family, of Robert the Bruce, that settled here, who had been an Imperial Guard of Napoleon, that actually was one of the settlers here in Chico. Bruce Road is named after the original Bruce family here in Chico. So John Bidwell seemed to have come here kind of in part as part of his family legacy, and had established Chico. And I believe that Chico was kind of established as a miniature of Washington, D.C. And at first I couldn't figure that out. I pondered, I'm like, they're setting this up just like a state capital or something. I mean, Chico's only a small town of about 80,000 people who live right in town, which passes for a small town anymore, I guess, a mid-sized town. But it used to be a smaller town and known for being that. And it was just curious that, these kind of arrangements had been met. But when really the key that unlocked the whole door to the association with Washington, D.C. was discovering that John Bidwell's wife, whose original name was Annie Ellicott Kennedy, had a direct familial relationship. I think she would have been the grand niece of Andrew Ellicott, the man who actually finished the design of Washington, D.C. after L'Enfant kind of backed out of the job. He was also the land surveyor that actually surveyed the 10-mile square diamond shaped of the original boundaries of Washington, D.C., and placed all the stone markers that are still there in the original boundaries of Washington, D.C., and he also executed the survey or layout of the actual street plan of Washington, D.C. that we all see. So to me, when I found that out, I was just amazed because I had already been looking at Chico for a long time before I made that connection. And it all made sense as well because Andrew Ellicott had also, along with James Madison, who he knew well, had done an extension of the famous Mason-Dixon line and also created a perpendicular line to that's now the western border of Pennsylvania called the Ellicott line as well. So this man was known to be one of the most famous land surveyors in the United States at that time, at the post-Revolutionary War era. Some of his ancestors were actually made the swords that George Washington's bodyguards had. So this is a family that's intimately associated with American history and especially the development of Washington, D.C. And as I said, the Mason-Dixon line as well is interesting because the diamond-shaped or chessboard plan of Chico is also a diamond, and the southern tip of it sits right on the latitude of the Mason-Dixon line. So to me, this became more than a coincidence at this point with all of these connections. I mean, nobody's writing down that, yes, this was what was done. But from an interpretive standpoint, it seems to be what was going on. I mean, even here later, we have the Cistercian monastery of New Clairvaux built with the city plaza pointing to that, and an original 11th century chapter house from the monastery of Santa Maria de Ovila in Spain, having been brought by the Hearst family and being rebuilt at the monastery. And so the property out there in Vina, California is interesting too. It took me a while to think why, that they're not building the monastery here because the city plaza points to it, but when I looked into the history of that property, I found that the early pioneer and friend of John Bidwell had originally owned that property, and he built a city there called Benton City, to which the very first Masonic charter in California was brought to originally.
Wow, that's interesting history right there.
Right, and after that failed, it was moved to Mount Shasta City, the charter, the same original charter, because eventually Lassen City kind of failed, and he moved a little bit back further to the east to Susanville and passed away there. And it just seems that this property was valued. Leland Stanford owned it at one time, and then it was deeded to Stanford University, who donated it to the monks of New Clairvaux, who run a winery there with delicious wine. And you can go out there and see this 11th century chapter house with Mason's marks on it, on some of the stones and everything. So it's kind of amazing that it could have all been arranged due to this. So in this line of reasoning also led me to see the involvement of later members of the Bacon family actually coming to Chico, and I believe having an impact on the development and these kind of talismanic architecture and tenets of things we see going on.
So we could safely say two things. It was all in the family, and it was a international, somewhat of a conspiracy to create the United States.
Right. And I think they were valuing a lot of these tenets of Sir Francis Bacon and all of the kind of intelligence service overtones of Bacon. We know he was involved in things like that too. And a lot of the hidden things in his work that people point to also support that notion. But really, they've applied this to kind of the American ideal of the Republic and encoding it along with the Greek mythology and even Sumerian mythology back to Queen Semiramis and the image of the Statue of Liberty and this value of the goddess through the whole thing too, kind of in part as an opposition to the ideals of the church. You know, this is I'm speaking now of the group of people that people usually identify with having created America without this hidden Catholic influence that I suggested before. So along the way, it kind of created this silent war as well in the United States between, you know, the kind of concepts we see, separation of church and state, and other people who wish to see the church have more influence in the way the country is run. So that's been going on too, with foreign influences kind of siding with one side or the other at various times as well. Really, well, kind of some of the inferences I've seen even suggest that some of the royal entities still lay claim to areas they claimed originally, no matter who manages them or controls them now.
This podcast is brought to you by Pure Hydrogen Peroxide. When you need a powerful disinfectant to kill mold, bacteria, and viruses like the coronavirus, you're going to need something like high-grade hydrogen peroxide, and that's exactly what I have for you. Go to purehydrogenperoxide.com and get a powerful disinfectant for your home, or if you're a healthcare provider or you work in the medical industry, make sure that your hospital or your healthcare facility has pure hydrogen peroxide, and it kills 99.9% of the germs, viruses, and bacteria out there. You don't want to be caught without it. This podcast is also brought to you by Mold Safe Solutions. When you're looking for something powerful to kill that demonic fungi lurking within your walls, you're going to want to use Mold Safe Solutions. Formulated by Mo, the Mold Man, you know where to go to get the best stuff to kill that mold in your house. Go to moldsafesolutions.com for more information or to get your cleaner today. Or you can go to our forum at moldsafesolutions.com/forum, where we'll answer your questions to your toxic mold problems and hopefully guide you in the right direction and give you the solutions you need.
If we look at a lot of the coat of arms for the various cities, around the world, when I was, in California, when I started studying, the occult and the secret mysteries of the world, I started noticing these symbols and the different cities would have these various seals. I don't know if we call them coat of arms, maybe city seals and so forth. And they were always, based on ancient symbols. And, you start researching them and they were done for a reason. So sure. That might correlate with the laid claims to these various cities. And of course, this time, the people, it was done in such a shroud and allegorically and with mysteries that the people that settled here that weren't involved in what we could say was the conspiracy to create the United States had no idea this was going on. And that's the way they wanted to keep it.
Well, really, that's what we see in the seal of Chico even today. That really, when you interpret that, it leads us now to the mysteries of Mount Shasta, which is incredible because on the seal of Chico is an oak tree. And in Chico, during the time of John Bidwell, is located what was once considered the largest oak tree in the world. And during a visit, it's interesting because throughout a lot of these stories that I found, including things like the Kensington Runestone, a lot of things having to do with the Hudson's Bay Company. I've seen the involvement of a group called the Linnaean Society of London, of which Thomas Jefferson and Alexander von Humboldt were also members of during their era. And this is a naturalist group that kind of, here comes your Baconian values again of the advancement of learning and science of that era as well. So John Bidwell was friends with a man named J.D. Hooker, who was also a first family of Hartford, Connecticut family. Even though J.D. Hooker was English, he was from the same Hooker family, of which Reverend Hooker in Hartford, Connecticut was the leader of the founders of Hartford, Connecticut in the 1620s. So, and this is all attested to on the Hartford Founders Monument and the general history of Hartford. So when J.D. Hooker came to Chico, this oak tree was actually named for him. It became known as the Hooker Oak. And this is as I say, it became such a symbol of Chico that it's on the seal of Chico. And the Hooker Oak died about 15 years ago, and they took all the wood and made benches in the courthouse and an organ at Chico State out of the wood, and they still saved all of the other wood from it as a value. So what's interesting, when I looked into the genealogy of John Bidwell's family in Hartford, and the original Bidwell founding member of Hartford was named John Bidwell as well, that he was actually related to the Hooker family. And that when, at one point, Connecticut was given a very liberal charter by James I when it was established. So later, much later in history, James II wanted to revoke the charter. So he sent representatives to Hartford to confiscate the charter that they had, because this gave them a great deal of autonomy compared to some of the other colonies, and he was trying to consolidate the rule of New England all into one governor instead of several. So to counteract this, the colonists took the charter and hid it in an oak tree that is now known as the Charter Oak of Connecticut, and this is indeed on the state quarter of Connecticut. So we see a kind of distant echo of this in the Hooker Oak here in Chico being named for J.D. Hooker, who was family to the original founder of Hartford, Connecticut. And really another interesting aside to the Charter Oak story is that John Wadsworth, a relative or predecessor of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, was the one who actually hid the charter in the tree. So this comes around to Mount Shasta, because when J.D. Hooker was here, as I said, they were both interested in the Linnaean Society and the taxonomy of plants and everything. John Bidwell is known as a pioneer of agriculture who developed strains of wheat and everything that would grow better here in Northern California. But J.D. Hooker came to Chico with Asa Gray. So John and Annie Bidwell, along with Asa Gray and J.D. Hooker and John Muir, the famous naturalist, now made a trip to Mount Shasta together. And on the surface, this may not seem to mean much, but as I began to read the correspondence of John Muir, I found a section of letters there where he was referring to this trip and told about how J.D. Hooker assailed them around the campfire with stories of his trips to the Himalayas. Indeed, to the region of the Himalayas that later kind of would become involved in theosophy, the hollow earth theories, the kind of suggestion of Agartha, that even the Nazis related to Asgard, of the Nordic faith and everything, that J.D. Hooker was fully aware of all of these concepts that we see now in the modern world, if not back to the turn of the 19th century or 20th century, that all of these myths and legends had been applied to Mount Shasta, such as a city beneath the mountain, people that could channel, entities and things like that, all having these kind of Eastern theosophic overtones that we see were developed by Madame Blavatsky and people like Nicholas Roerich. So amazingly, I got on this jag of looking into the genealogy of John Bidwell. And I found, first of all, that one of the Biddulph ancestors was William Bidwell. And this was during the time of James I, and this man was actually one of the people who helped to compile the King James Version. So this man was an amazing intellect and writer, and he actually lived in Aleppo, Syria for an extended period of time in the late 1500s and early 1600s, which is really amazing when you think about it, that at that date he had lived there in the Holy Land and everything, and then helped to compile the King James Version. But also I found that John Bidwell was related via just marriages in their family in the Hartford area to the family of Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon faith, which is very interesting. And then I found that he was also in the same fashion, their families were intermarried with Henry Steele Olcott, the co-founder of the Theosophical Society and a kind of partner in spirit of Madame Blavatsky as well. I found that he was related to Harvey Spencer Lewis, who had founded the Rosicrucian order in San Jose. And I found that he was also distantly related to Guy Ballard, who created the, quote, I am activity at Mount Shasta, that all of these concepts, kind of have their roots in theosophical ideas and things like that. So it was very amazing to at least, even though some of the relationships weren't direct, that their families were all related and that this mythology had sprung up at Mount Shasta, possibly intentionally or for reasons of their own, as part of this kind of a silent war that we were speaking of before.
It's interesting. It's all in the family with that, and they must have loved the weather in California, huh?
Oh, it's great. It's freezing here today, but our spring starts in February, so it's coming soon.
Sure, definitely.
That's when it warms up here, so it's good.
Yeah, and why does Mount Shasta play such a prominent role as a location in this developing story?
Well, I think if you go to Mount Shasta, even regardless of any beliefs or, what your philosophy or religion is, you'll just be awestruck by the way it looks. It's a 14,150 feet high, approximately, somewhere right in there. And it's surrounded by mountains no higher than 6,000 feet. And you can see it, from 100 miles away in many places. And that was interesting to me, too, because I know I used to work around Mount Shasta a lot or up in that region. And you come to associate where you are with the view of the mountain from that direction. So a landmark like that kind of serves as a natural axis or reference point, even for Native American people who valued Mount Shasta very much. And a lot of the local tribes have their creation myths associated with Mount Shasta, that when I really looked into those, it was interesting too, because a lot of them have the same concepts, like biblical concepts involved in them, about the creator, creating the mountain as a wigwam to live in. And then later we see the kind of more Rosicrucian or theosophical views or these legends of cities beneath the mountain emerging. So I see that time after time too in my studies. There's issues like, Moctezuma predicted the day Cortez came and things like that you kind of wonder how much license has been taken in later history. Or I think one thing people overlook are the development of intelligence services and kind of manipulation of what people considered their enemy at any given time. I mean, in Mexico, for instance, we know that the Spanish were taking slaves from there for 20 or 30 years before Cortez even went. So they could learn a lot or even send people back to gather information or influence people, just like we see earlier, or in Elizabethan England, possibly John Dee was a spy. He was known as 007 to the Queen and things like that. So a lot of people, when they're looking at your alternate history, should not forget to take into account, the manipulative nature or people spinning history the way they would like for a desired outcome. So you kind of have to, that's why it helps to look at genealogy, interpret historical facts, and look at these the structures that they're giving you in the interpretive artwork. Once you kind of develop a vocabulary of looking at things like that, everything starts to fall together. And it's really brilliant. And Mo, I know you know this too, because it's all done in a way that when you try to explain it to other people, you sound like a raving lunatic.
Well, to people that don't have a basic understanding, right? I agree.
Right.
Sure.
So that part of it's brilliant there. And, you really have to have an education and know things, which, by the way, I think people, in the 18th and 19th century or 1700s and 1800s were much more well-read than the average Joe today, that they were more aware of these things. Even, people with lower levels of education that could read could learn all of these things. In those days, that was their media. That's what they did. And that's why really later, I think part of we're addressing the development of the American ideal. I think we see a lot of authors like Poe, Longfellow, who I mentioned before, Emerson, and others all being even associated with the Society of the Cincinnati and kind of intentionally instilling kind of American views and values in their work, and possibly even acting as spies. So that's kind of amazing when I found that out too. I mean, when I looked into Oak Island and the Newport Tower and the Kensington Runestone, I saw the family of Edgar Allan Poe, his family relations being possibly involved in all of those things. And with even Poe producing a poem called El Dorado that may refer to the Newport Tower, I found that Edgar Allan Poe's mother was an Arnold, related directly to Benedict Arnold Sr., who was one of the founders of Newport, Rhode Island, and the common history states that it was his stone-built windmill being directly related to Edgar Allan Poe. Benedict Arnold Jr., the famous controversial Revolutionary War figure, was from, I think, the 11th generation of John Arnold I, and Elizabeth Arnold Poe's mother was from the 12th generation, and even, was from a family that had maintained the name the entire time. So that was really interesting to find out, and an eye-opener when I did, to find Poe related to that. And then even in my examination of Oak Island, I found that after the French were expelled from French Arcadia, and it was named Nova Scotia, a lot of colonists from what would become the United States were invited to settle there. And this included even the Longfellow family, who had extensive holdings there, and the Allen family, who was related to John Allen, the man who adopted Edgar Allan Poe. And a lot of these people that were from Maine or Massachusetts that went to Nova Scotia even came and fought on the side of the colonies in the Revolutionary War, and some of them were made members of the Society of the Cincinnati, which was a group of Revolutionary War officers, including their French cohorts, that created a society that was kind of aimed at promoting the concept of a republic around the world. So a lot of these artists, like Longfellow, his direct ancestor in the Wadsworth, who I mentioned before in association with the founding of Hartford, were Revolutionary War heroes. I mean, even, Longfellow House in Massachusetts was what George Washington used as his headquarters for a period of time. And so they had their allegiances, I think, to the American ideal and promoted that in their literature and works, and possibly even in a clandestine manner. I mean, we see Longfellow later interpreting Dante and things like that have a lot of association with Knights Templar and all these kind of ideals we've been discussing. So Poe, I think, was involved in all of that as well. I mean, even one of his last works, Eureka, refers to concepts like time-based vortexes, and he talks about Sir Francis Bacon in that piece, and Aristotle, and all of these philosophers in a way that is really cryptic and really related to this 19th century view of kind of some of these axes or special places I'm looking at having something to do with time warps, even in a kind of science fiction view that's straight out of Jules Verne and the Poe era, that actually, kind of gained some traction among people like Jean Cocteau and Salvador Dali later, and kind of involved Nicholas Roerich and that whole era of mysticism, including Manly P. Hall as well.
And we could connect all this stuff back to the Abrahamic religions and so forth, and they're all intertwined and interconnected through history. And, just to drop a little knowledge that might help you in your studies, do you know about the oak tree being associated in the Bible with the oak of Abraham?
Yes, that, okay. And also, and the Druidic value, too. Even the naming of a tree like that has Celtic overtones, too.
Sure. So we could say it's the tree of God that they designated a long time ago.
Sure, and the Norse tree of life, all of those images with the having to do with the sacred tree, definitely.
When I looked at my ancestry, my research has dealt a lot with the island of Crete and the Mediterranean Sea. And do you know that the largest oak tree in the world is there? Interesting.
What a coincidence.
Yeah, and it's called. Guess what it's called?
I couldn't venture, Mo.
Well, the oak of Abraham.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Wow. Well, that makes sense too, and especially in light of Western culture and all of the myths of Europa and everything associated. I mean, even here in Chico, on part of this alignment from the city plaza to the monastery, they recently constructed a labyrinth. Mm-hmm. 1/2 scale version of the one at Chartres Cathedral. So that's interesting too.
Yeah, which they, of course, on Crete had a labyrinth as well.
Right. It all refers to that.
Yeah. And then if you do the etymology of Crete, it essentially means to create. And if we look at the island of Crete, Kenosis, he had Sir Arthur Evans. He dubbed them the Minoans, but we could just call them the Cretans. They were the descendants of the Phoenicians, and then of course they were interconnected with the Greeks as well. But they were the first builders, and Greece and Athens were the ones that employed them. And there was a lot of famous masons that are encoded into their history that they honor, that come from that island. And the first emperors in Rome, I believe, for the first few hundred years were all descendants and ancestors from Crete.
Right.
And then if you look at archaeology and history, they call Crete the center or the beginning of Western civilization in Europe and so forth. So
right, yeah, I was just watching a documentary about that, and they even attribute the Mycenaean culture coming from there as well now.
Exactly, and they were definitely interconnected at the time with Egypt as well. Ptolemy had a lot to do there. Do you know Constantine, actually, that was where his vacation home was?
No, I didn't. That's really interesting and not surprising at all, too, because one of the huge connections I found was Empress Theodora, the wife of Justinian I, who really continued this tradition, starting with Semiramis of the harlot, having an impact on Christian faith that's alternate, because she grew up in Alexandria, Egypt, and was trained in a kind of Coptic form of Christianity. So when she became the empress, even at Basilica San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy, which was created by Justinian I and Theodoric the Great, there's a mosaic of her, and she's holding a jeweled chalice, and all of her priesthood, or priestesses, I should say, are wearing Coptic tunic patches. So there's a lot of things about her. She was cast as a prostitute dancing girl who, left her evil ways behind and learned how to weave. And she ended up marrying the emperor. And she's really one of these people that preserve this kind of sacred feminine, for lack of a better term, this mythology that's also applied to Mary Magdalene and Queen Semiramis, that these strong women kind of had these impacts on history that were covered up over time.
Yeah, no, when we look at those names, I want you to, of course, think back, just like you're giving us this great history, on Northern California with the Bidwell families and all these different things that they encoded, and you have all these names connecting. My understanding is that they encoded royal names throughout the Bible and in their history. So hence the reason for rewriting the Bible, such as the King James Bible. Powers change at the top and stories are told and encoded.
For their own reasons, exactly.
For their own reasons, yeah. So it's definitely interesting. And did you know that the sheriffs, before they were called sheriffs, they were called Caesars?
Interesting. That makes sense, too.
Sure. And then we have all the Roman symbols, of course, in the United States Capitol as well.
Right, they're the county, the sheriff of the county of the count, right?
Sure, you got it.
Makes total sense. I think about that all the time.
And do you have any knowledge in regards to, you had mentioned Helena Blavatsky being tied into this and so forth, and she was, of course, one of the most famous Russian occultists in the history that I know of, or we know of here in the West. Does Russia have anything to do with any of this history? Have you found out?
It certainly does, and it's really interesting because both Blavatsky and Roerich were kind of products of Imperial Russia. That when the revolution happened, they never went back and weren't part of Russia anymore, at least as far as we know, because kind of these Rosicrucian or mystical overtones that we see, being attributed to Rasputin mostly in the imperial family of Russia, a lot of people neglect to see how they were intermarried with the Hanoverian Stuarts that ruled England.
Exactly. And they were, I believe, intermarried with the German nobles as well.
Exactly. They were all connected into that. And amazingly, I even found that, Saint Germain appears to be related to Elizabeth of Bohemia and Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who are both right in that Hanoverian earlier line that became the kings of England. Their intermarriages of her brother and Saint Germain's brother into the Stuart family, Count Rákóczi. So that's an interesting connection too. And then later, of course, we see even in the press lately, Prince Charles talking about how he's related to Vlad the Impaler, stuff like that. So I even found that Queen Marie of Romania had an interesting connection to this reproduction of the Palace of the Legion of Honor of Paris that's in San Francisco, and descendants of George Washington, who also built a replica of Stonehenge in Washington State. So that and believe it or not, that links us back to who the people I believe left the Kensington Runestone, because that family came right from Alexandria, Minnesota, where the Kensington Runestone Museum is, right near Minneapolis. I believe the Hill family, they also funded the construction of a Catholic cathedral in Minneapolis, even though they weren't Catholic. So we're back to this kind of Jacobite tradition, that we have.
Ecumenical all the way back then with them, at least, right?
Right. So it's interesting that, like, after Romania was assumed by the kind of communist fervor, that Queen Marie, or she was afraid this would happen, put all of her royal regalia in the Mary Hill Museum of Art that had been built by Samuel Hill, who was a descendant of George Washington and the first families of Jamestown. So that's a point I could make, too, here. We see the Mayflower descendants, these first families of Hartford, the first families of Virginia from Jamestown and Williamsburg, all kind of using this family tradition and valuing their family ties to work through time to develop things like the Great Northern Railroad, other corporate interests of the Republic, and working together, to attain these goals. even along with their family that still existed in England. I mean, when I researched George Washington, I found he's related to the Spencers of Lady Diana. And there's even a Washington crypt on the Althorpe estate of the Spencers in England. So there were still these Jacobite families in England that never left, that had allegiances or values with the hidden Catholics and Americans, which is really interesting too. And even Winston Churchill was a member of the Spencer family as well. And even in my studies in Nova Scotia, I ran across a man that I felt had some involvement in things up there named George Washington Churchill.
Interesting. And in your research, I know a lot of this, of course, goes back, 100 years, 200 years, and of course, further than that. Fast forward to now, we see, the United States presidents, most of them are related to Charlemagne, and they'll say William the Conqueror as well. So we have it again, even the United States presidents are in the family.
That's true. I found it's hard to find one that hasn't had those associations. And, along the way, there's a lot of interesting stories with that, with different factions, of people who did value the church or others that tried to develop, I think, kind of some of these alternate, non-traditional forms of faith that we've seen developing may have really had a purpose in them to kind of counteract the influence of the traditional forms of Christianity in the development of the country. I think there was earlier on a large faction that actively opposed all of that and wanted people to, sure, go ahead and practice your faith, but let's keep it out of the government.
Sure.
So a lot of these things, that's why they may have intelligence service overtones to them, that they were manipulated and used. And, unfortunately, a lot of that applies to the way Native Americans were dealt with as well, which is kind of a sad overlay to this whole story in the West. But
they were conquered. That's
exactly.
what happens, unfortunately. And a lot of us, we're conquered as well. I think who was the George Carlin, you're not in with the in club. You're never going to be, and it's not, I'd say, something that we should, cry about, because it's just the way the world works. We're kind of the subjects. And if we want to, be more blunt with it, the slaves of some of these royal families that I feel still rule behind the throne. It seems like this is like the apocalypse, I almost feel like right now, Cort, that you have so much chaos going on, disinformation, but in amongst the chaos, there's little bits of truce. And if you have studied this history, you could kind of see that. So, for example, we saw Pope Francis, the first Jesuit pope in the history of the Roman Catholic Church, come here to the United States, and he's treated like a dignitary. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree exactly with what you're saying, and it's hard for a lot of people to sort out all these kind of intricacies and everything, but it speaks to the silent war, between factions of people who believe, one extreme or the other. Mm-hmm. And what you were saying about, these groups of people just don't give up.
Sure.
This isn't just going to go away. That I can understand why people like Thomas Jefferson or James Madison, who were really smart people that had studied history, had been to France, knew what was going on compared to the way they had grown up in the colonies, and just saw, that part of the problem was this eternal conflict between the monarchy and the church, vying for the hearts and minds of the people.
Sure.
That was one of the interesting things about this whole California odyssey I've been on, is that the whole development of California was really different. We see the colonies in the East developing. Meanwhile, here in California, we had people who were interested in developing the Republic, dealing with the Russian colony, with all kinds of French and German and Swiss interest of people coming during the gold rush, or just prior to the time that California became part of the United States in 1850. So there was a lot of intrigue and jockeying around going on there. And really one of the interests that really, this is going to relate to Mount Shasta again, does have to do with an imperial power building a tower in the tradition of the Axis that was due south of Mount Shasta on the property that would become Stanford University. And this is known as the Frenchman's Tower of Palo Alto today. And it's a simple brick structure that may have been used as a water tower. But the story of the Frenchman has always been kind of an interesting mystery in that part of the Bay Area, in that a man named Peter Kautz came and established a premier stock farm there on this property that would later become Stanford University. And he built this tower due south of Mount Shasta. And as I began, I saw that there was a tower there. This is already after I gained my knowledge of what that might mean, and I had worked in Palo Alto years ago and even read an article in the paper about it when I was there about nobody knew what this was or what it meant, So I was already familiar with the story of Rennes-le-Château in France, which is a similar landscape mystery to many of the things that we've been discussing, that involves a structure known as the Tour Magdala, or the Tower of Magdala. And there, a lot of researchers speculate that Henry V, the exiled king of France in the 1840s, his family had later funded the construction of this because there's supposed to be a Merovingian crypt there of people he was related to. So when I compared the dates of birth and death of Peter Kautz, they closely match those of Henry V's time of exile from when he was banned from France, which was interesting. And then later, as you read the story of the Frenchman's Tower, this man Peter Kautz later admits that his real name is Paulin Caperon, a French name. So that's interesting as well. And the locals kind of freaked out on this man. They didn't know what he was doing in this strange tower. Later they found tunnels in the hillside behind the tower and all of this that kind of relates to some of these Enochian overtones that we see at places like Oak Island and other treasure mysteries, and even at the Kensington Rune or the mystery of Bacon's Vault in Williamsburg. But it's really interesting that all of the evidence I came up with suggests at the very least that it's remotely possible that Paulin Caperon was actually Henry V, the exiled king of France, or he was an associate of his. And Henry V is from the Artois family, which is a word whose etymology has to do with artesian springs and waters. And even for part of his life, Henry V lived in Evian, France, which is famous for its springs. And we know that Nestle, the Swiss company, is also associated with the Artois family. So given that, it was really interesting that this alignment with the Frenchman's Tower that was created in the 1860s, I later found that Nestle had attempted to buy 2 locations to develop water bottling plants on, one of them including Mount Shasta.
Sure, and that probably is a good reason why wherever they go, they pretty much get the water rights that they want wherever they want to go. So. And
it also speaks to how this kind of tradition, I think, is viewed as a way of blessing your venture. You see, like many of the central business districts of large cities are situated along these axes or talismanic array. Like in Washington, D.C., the central shopping district's just north of the White House along the White House Meridian. In New York City, it's 6th Avenue, or the Avenue of the Americas, that I found a lot of interesting associations with the obelisk in Central Park and other structures in New York City. So it wouldn't be out of the definition I have developed for this to consider that somebody who had created an axis earlier and a prime meridian would later value it even today associated with Mount Shasta. And there's even evidence that here we go back to our Society of the Cincinnati literary figures. There's the poet of the Sierras here in California. His name is Joaquin Miller. His original name was Cincinnatus Miller. And I did indeed find a Lieutenant Miller who was a member of the Society of the Cincinnati right after the Revolutionary War. I couldn't hook them up, but I have a strong suspicion that he was involved because he even kind of went to Europe as a spy after he had lived at Mount Shasta for a period. Joaquin Miller wrote a book called My Life Amongst the Modocs, and he became more famous in England than he did in the United States for his literary works. I mean, some of the things you read about him is that he even taught Buffalo Bill how to dress Western. And when you see pictures of him, you know, he looks like the archetypical mountain man, cowboy guy with the long beard and everything. So he was a big hit in England and Europe and traveled the continent, was said to have spent time in all the royal courts of Europe. And here this is beginning to sound like Saint Germain and Dr. John Dee or a spy again. You know,
Sure.
just like Longfellow had done before, and other James Fenimore Cooper, who, you know, drums along the Mohawk. He had a life that reflected this in a relation to the Society of the Cincinnati as well. So here we even had Joaquin Miller. When he returned from Europe, he lived on the White House Meridian in Washington, D.C., in a log cabin for 2 years. You know, it's seemingly to me that later evidence will show that he was doing this on purpose, that he had even picked this point that is now part of Meridian Hill Park that marks the White House Meridian there near Howard University in northern Washington, D.C., and lived in this log cabin that's since been moved to Rock Creek Park, that they preserved the cabin, and it's still used for poetry readings and things like that today. But when he moved back to California, he established his Heights estate at a point in eastern Oakland, California there that is exactly 180 degrees due south of the peak of Mount Shasta. And on his property, he proceeded to build the Pyramid to Moses, the John Fremont Tower, and another tower there that doesn't have a name or anything. That's very interesting. But he also built a stone funeral pyre that when he passed away, he demanded that he be burned on the funeral pyre. And at that time, his wife kind of refused to do that. So as the legend or story goes that you read, his Bohemian Club brothers went and dug him up and burned him on the funeral pyre anyway. So that's an interesting story. But Joaquin Miller's a real character, and just it is really interesting that on a lot of his book covers are some esoteric symbols that I found associated with Jamestown and the Kensington Runestone. And that's a whole nother show, but what I'm seeing is a proliferation of those kind of symbols associated with knighthood and the Catholic Church at many points of the mystery that I found associated with this architecture and line of people, you know. And I know there's other authors and personalities that talk about the Kensington Runestone a lot, but when I looked into that, I found something totally 100% different than the way that's being spun to the public now.
That's what I'm finding in my own research, Cort. So don't feel bad. We're definitely the black sheep of this kind of history and research, and that's okay.
And I do feel bad about that too, because I've got to know some of the people, you know.
Yeah.
And it's not easy, you know, when you really expose some of these things. It even crushes just recently established paradigms that people are starting to believe. And really, I did want to point that out. There's some of these things, you know, in the media that, you know, you deal in, and me just being an author, that some of that may even be manipulated and messed with to gain a certain outcome, you know?
Yeah.
So one always needs to be, and I don't think that's the case with you, Mo. I've listened to your show a lot. I think you're a straight shooter. And, it's out there. I'm not going to point any fingers or anything. I would just tell everybody to use caution and use common sense and look everything up yourself.
Exactly.
Don't believe me, even everything I'm saying, go check it out.
Yeah.
Look it up.
This information, it can be dangerous as well. So you need to understand they did this for a reason. I believe today that this should be known, that they don't have to worry, whoever is ruling out there, and that this history someday will be common history, and the faux history and the doctored history that we have now will eventually go away. And, I have much respect for all the work that they've done. Of course, I don't agree with everything that is going on and so forth, but here I am, just a subject, right, of these people and
Sure.
Whoever the powers that be are. And I am thankful that we do have free speech right now, Cort, and we can talk about this stuff freely. And, as you said, people that do listen to you that are outside of the scope of research and have not done any of the research themselves, you can sound crazy to them. So their job there, they've won there as well. Media, I do know, in 2013, they passed the propaganda law, making it legal for the government to issue propaganda against
Right.
the public. And what people need to understand listening out there, that this is done for a reason. We might not agree with it, but they have secrets and very powerful military people and businesses and so forth that they want to protect. And it seems like with the internet, some of this information is getting out there. But there's some information that I come across that I have to think about before I release. And there's been times that I feel that I've been warned various ways to stop going down a certain path. I don't know. Have you ever had that yourself, Cort, or you've kind of just did your own thing?
Well, I've had some hints here and there that people don't appreciate what I'm saying. I've tried not to let that affect me.
Sure.
A lot of people will take shots at you on the internet, and you shouldn't pay any attention to that. But I've had some people confront me personally. But, with regard to what you were saying about how everything's obscured and covered up, I'd like to stress that, you can't tear these buildings down.
Right.
The messages are there. And really what they did was take the same techniques that have been used, for millennia, forever by royal interests that manipulate and encode and place things in your mind. And what they did was create a mystery school of the Republic of the United States of America for you to go and decipher all of that, and in many cases to see what BS it is and move on accordingly.
Sure.
So
they even
that's
tell
there.
us on the CIA building, the truth shall set you free, right?
Right. But if you really look into it, it's funny. I remember visiting Washington, D.C. when I was in high school, living in Virginia, and it's kind of a Bible Belt oriented place. And the teacher telling us, if there's things you see here that you don't understand, just remember that they're talking about the people who invented democracy and the way our government is. So to a large degree, that's true.
Sure.
And it's way more complex than that. But a lot of these people are rationalist thinkers that want you to make an attempt yourself to learn what's going on and not just be told by just contemplating what they left for you. And Thomas Jefferson was really big on that. A lot of the founding fathers were. And as I said, during this era, it was a little easier for people to figure out, I think, because they were read a lot more and were maybe better educated on average than we are now. And it was easier for them to see this. And as time has gone on, we see people mischaracterizing it like it's something evil, that it refers to bad things, which it does in some cases, but you have to look at it like they're teaching you a lesson.
I agree.
There's metaphorical information there, not literally what you're being told sometimes.
Sure. And as I had mentioned, I don't agree with everything that's going on from the top, but I do understand. And in previous, empires and so forth, there were many kings and emperors that were tyrants, and they would often execute their slaves en masse for the smallest of things. So people need to understand out there. And then, for talking back or, bad mouthing the king or the powers that be, that sure would get you beheaded or burned at the stake. I think we're in a unique time now. I think that it's going to change, and maybe not in our lifetimes, Cort, but maybe in our children or in our future generations, they'll see the truth for what it is. I see that kind of happening now, and I definitely want to have you on in the future, Cort. Do you mind coming on in the next couple months again, and we could talk, more about different subjects in depth and go
Sure.
into okay. Awesome.
Of course, it's been great, man. It's been therapy talking to you, Mo. It's great to talk to somebody who's well informed. I should interview you.
No, it's great to talk to you. I learn a lot from my guests, and I try to, pick guests to come on the show that I learn from. I look at you guys, I know you're a student of this history, but you're also a teacher, and you're sharing that. And that's what all the great philosophers and historians had did in the past, so it's awesome. And I think it's our job now, instead of allegorizing it, to say what it is for what it is, and to say it simply where the common man can understand. And as you had mentioned, most common men will think you're crazy, but the few that will respect it will appreciate it. And I think the majority of the people listening to this show, and I know the other podcast that you've been on, a lot of those people are open-minded, and they love this type of stuff. So it's an honor to have you on the show, and I look forward to definitely having you on in the future. But before we wrap up the show today, can you tell the audience where is the best place they can find your great work or any of the books that you have?
Sure. Well, I have a blog, survivalcell.blogspot.com, that has links to all my book sales on CreateSpace. I have 5 books for sale now, including The Geographic Mysteries of Sir Francis Bacon, The Prophecy of Dante and the New Jerusalem of Ravenna, and another book about Edgar Allan Poe and the mysteries he's involved in that I have. I'm working one on about the White House Meridian now that will be interesting. It includes some of the new information I told you about Chico. And I also have an author page, Cort Lindhal, on Facebook, so feel free to go there or send me a friend request there.
Sure, and I'll be sure to put all those links on the Gnostic Warrior radio show and podcast page for this podcast so everybody could find you. Cort, it has been a great pleasure speaking with you today. I learned a lot, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the near future. Take care, brother.
Yeah, thank you, Mo. I've learned a lot from you, too. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Take care.
This podcast is brought to you by Pure Hydrogen Peroxide. When you need a powerful disinfectant to kill mold, bacteria, and viruses like the coronavirus, you're going to need something like high-grade hydrogen peroxide, and that's exactly what I have for you. Go to purehydrogenperoxide.com and get a powerful disinfectant for your home, or if you're a healthcare provider or you work in the medical industry, make sure that your hospital or your healthcare facility has pure hydrogen peroxide, and it kills 99.9% of the germs, viruses, and bacteria out there. You don't want to be caught without it. This podcast is also brought to you by Mold Safe Solutions. When you're looking for something powerful to kill that demonic fungi lurking within your walls, you're going to want to use Mold Safe Solutions. Formulated by Mo, the Mold Man, you know where to go to get the best stuff to kill that mold in your house. Go to moldsafesolutions.com for more information or to get your cleaner today. Or you can go to our forum at moldsafesolutions.com/forum, where we'll answer your questions to your toxic mold problems and hopefully guide you in the right direction and give you the solutions you need.